Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duel Links video. Today what we thought we'd do is we would go over the changes that we would make to the limit, restricted or ban list to try and improve the current format in Rush Duel Links. So right now we have basically been seeing Mataran being extraordinarily dominant, we've had Light Galaxy as our second best deck, and we've had Cyber Dragon bring up that third place, but we do have plenty of other decks that are almost vying for one of those top spots but aren't quite able to keep up with those top three decks. So if we take a look at our current meta breakdown, we can see Mataran is making up 51.9% of top 4 points, which is ridiculous. This is the first time in Rush Duel Links history that we've had a deck be this dominant. We have had some which have been close. The closest we have had was with the release of Steel Kaleido Mirror, and the Machine deck was very, very dominant, but it still was not as dominant as Mataran is right now. So this deck definitely needs some sort of hit. The second is Light Galaxy with 27.3%. Light Galaxy still very, very powerful in its own right. It's a very aggressive deck, and it can be a bit frustrating to play against and to build against. Then we have Cyber Dragon, which is bringing up the rear. This deck was going on a tear when Go Rush first launched, but has since fallen off quite a bit, but is still a bit of a nightmare on the ladder. And then we get to our lower down decks that aren't really fighting for that top spot, but they're still around. We have the Warrior Fusion, we have the Machine Good Stuff, we have Miss Mutton, and we have Elemental Heroes. They're all hanging in there, but not really performing as well as we would like them to. And a big reason for that is that these other decks are just so strong. So what changes would I put in place to try to fix the current meta, or at least improve it, in my opinion? So the first deck we're going to talk about is our third place deck, Cyber Dragon. So Cyber Dragon itself is currently limit 3. We don't really want to touch this card specifically. This deck is quite easily able to make Cyber Twin Dragon only using 3 cards. It's kind of the gimmick of the deck, right? We can summon out the Cyber Dragons by special summoning, or we can use a Proto Cyber Dragon, and then just by using 2 copies and the fusion spell, we can go into a Cyber Twin Dragon, which is really good card economy. If we think about a lot of the other fusion boss monsters, we have to summon a monster, tribute to summon out the boss monster, let's say for example Dragius. Then we'd have to summon out our Star Dragon and then use Fusion, which is a 5-card investment. Now, because of the skills that we have, a lot of the skills do just search that Fusion, so we take that out. That's still a 4-card investment. So being able to summon Cyber Twin Dragon as only a 3-card investment is really, really good. And Cyber Twin Dragon is a really strong card. 2800 attack, fantastic. Attack twice, fantastic, especially since those attacks can be on monsters or direct attacks. But this does have a few downsides. Cyber Twin Dragon is only a level 8, which means it can get popped by a lot more cards. Basically, in Rush Duels, a lot of cards do specifically affect level 8 and lower, 9 or lower, or 10 and lower cards, which means Cyber Twin Dragon being level 8 means it will be hit by a lot more cards. Right now, the most relevant for that is going to be Cyber Assault Dragon, that can just pop your Cyber Twin, as well as Slime, which can be activated when a level 8 or lower monster attacks. So Cyber Twin Dragon does have a few weaknesses, as well as the fact our skill doesn't actually plus us, and that's probably because of how easy it is to make Cyber Twin Dragon already. When we use the Cyber Dragon skill, we give up a card from our hand and then replace it, which means we're not actually gaining anything from it. If we were just add, for example, a fusion from our deck of Graveyard to our hand like the other skills, we would be able to effectively just make a 2-card fusion, and only giving up 2 cards from our hand, so that Cyber Twin Dragon, seems a bit crazy. But Cyber Twin Dragon isn't the only fusion monster in this deck. We can also make the Cyber End Dragon. A Cyber End Dragon is a level 10, so it's a little bit better in that regard. It has 4000 attack and piercing, which is quite nice, but it doesn't have any kind of trap protection. So that is a solid 4-card investment to get at your boss monster that can just die to widespread ruin. But we're going in the right direction. Now, a similar card to the Cyber End Dragon that the Cyber Dragon deck does use is Ancient Gear Golem, and this card is crazy strong. 3000 attack, 3000 defense, fantastic. Being able to set this on turn 1 is really, really good. Very few things will easily out this. There is something like a Harvey that will easily get rid of this, but not many decks are actually playing that. And this thing also stops your opponent from activating traps when it declares an attack, which is really good. Turning off your opponent's battle traps, especially their legends, is unbelievably powerful. And on top of all of that, it also gets piercing, which is really, really strong. I think if we were going to hit a card in the Cyber Dragon deck, we would be hitting Ancient Gear Golem. But realistically, I don't think this deck needs a hit. This deck just doesn't feel as unfair as the top 2 decks, and as we saw during our meta breakdown, really this deck is not pulling its weight as much as the other 2, so realistically I think this deck is probably fine to be left as is, but we will be hitting the decks above it. And what better place to start than Galaxy. So Light Galaxy is a very, very strong deck right now. It's somewhat overshadowed by Mataran, but it is still very good in its own right. Being able to use Secret Order to basically spam out these high level monsters, then we use Meteor Charge to change our opponent's monsters to defense as well as give our monsters piercing, allow us to get in for a lot of damage very, very quickly. So any deck that's a little bit slow, maybe needs a few turns to set up, can get heavily punished by this deck. As well as, because of the way Meteor Charge works, we can punish our opponents for having low attack and low defense. If we manage to change a low attack monster to attack mode, attack over it, we get in for a ton of damage. And if our opponent plays low defense monsters, well, we're going to be piercing over those. So we're also going to be doing a ton of damage that way as well. So this deck is very, very good, very, very quick, and basically plans to end the game in 2 to 3 turns ideally. Now, this won't always work out this way. Sometimes you will just draw a duff hand, but this deck is still extraordinarily strong and really does punish you for playing weak monsters. On top of that, this deck's skill is basically a plus, which is really good for a deck like this. And it's a really, really good plus as well, because if we think about it, we can discard, let's say, Galactic Oblivion, then we add Secret Order to our hand. So we've -1, then we +1. So we've broken even, right? But that Secret Order is going to bring back our Galactica Oblivion. So that's going to be a 1 card to get out our Galactica Oblivion. So the number of cards we actually have hasn't changed. We still have 4 cards in hand. We have a Galactica Oblivion on the field. But that Galactica Oblivion should have cost us 2 extra cards to get out. So it's sort of like we've just +2'd. Now there is a little bit of mental gymnastics to get there, but depending on how you think about it, it's like we get a massive plus or a massive discount at the very least for our Galactica Oblivion, which is really, really strong, especially when we can combine it with Meteor Charge. So how do we want to hit this deck? Well, I would put Meteor Charge to 2. So there's a couple of reasons we want to put Meteor Charge to 2. First off, only having 2 copies of this card does mean that your opponent won't be able to just absolutely bully you with triple Meteor Charge and wipe you out of the game. It also means that we're not putting Charge to 3, which would then have it directly conflict with Secret Order. I think that would absolutely kill this deck. But it also would take away more defensive options because, for example, Negate Attack is currently limit 2. So by putting Meteor Charge to limit 2, you now have to decide whether you're going to play 1 and 1, or you're going to play 2 Meteor Charge and no Negate Attack, which is quite a meaningful decision. Now, this might be a little bit heavy-handed. This might, in some ways, make it so Light Galaxy doesn't really have much of a win condition against some decks, but the deck is so powerful right now, only really losing out to Cyber Dragon has quite a good matchup into it, and Mataran does beat it quite often as well. Means that if we do hit Mataran, and Mataran does get hit quite hard and does fall out that top spot, Light Galaxy is here, ready and waiting to take it, so I think realistically we have to hit this deck as well. And finally, we have the Mataran deck, the #1 deck, and this deck definitely needs to get hit. Over half of our top 4 finishers in tournaments at the moment are Mataran, because the deck is just that strong. As well as the fact that Mataran has won 10 of the last 14 tournaments, which just goes to show how dominant this deck really is. This deck can quite easily summon multiple level 9 2800 attack fusion monsters in a single turn that have decent effects, such as the Ashura Star. The Mataran skill, Mataran script, also basically does 3 things, which is pretty bonkers for Rush. So first off, it lets you search your imaginary actor, because we can get it out of our deck, put it into the graveyard. Now, you might be saying, well, that hasn't put it into your hands, so you haven't, searched it. But think about it like this. We have 2 imaginary actor in deck, 3 imaginary reactor in deck, and we also have 3 copies of Star Restart. So basically, we've just increased the number of ways we have to get to Imaginary Actor by quite a lot, as well as the fact that we are also playing Monster Reincarnation, which is just an extra way to get it back to our hand. So having 9 ways to get to half of your fusion is pretty crazy. The skill also lets us send Monster Reincarnation to the graveyard, which, if we have Imaginary Reactor, basically gives us Pot of Greed, which is really, really good, especially since, much like making a Cyber Twin Dragon, making a Mataran fusion monster is a 3-card investment, as we just need 2 vanillas and our fusion spell card. So every time we draw 2 cards, we potentially draw 66% of a fusion, which is really, really good. And if we draw out the Monster Reincarnation early, we can activate it, put it back into our deck using a reactor, and then use our skill and send it back to the graveyard and summon a reactor again and just do it again. Having double Pot of Greed is crazy, especially for right now where we are in the meta. It's just too fast. And if that's not enough, it also will allow you to gain access to Imaginary Arc Turbo, which basically lets you deal with anything else we couldn't already deal with. If we activate Imaginary Arc Turbo, we can just get a massive boost, which could end the game. We could use it as a 1500 boost onto one of our 1400s to make it 29 to give us a third big attacker, or we can use it with one of our big fusion monsters and get up to 4300 to allow it to out things we normally wouldn't be able to out, such as Cyber End Dragon and such as yugioh. Realistically, the Mataran deck has very few weaknesses. First off, all of their main deck monsters have 500 defense, that's quite punishable, and then the only other real weakness they have is that you have to draw the fusion to actually make any of these plays happen. But most decks also have a similar restriction, except Mataran doesn't really do anything without fusion, it just kind of sits there with low attack monsters and waits to get fusion, so I suppose that is a reasonably big weakness, but it doesn't seem to be holding them back too much considering they are winning almost every single tournament. And finally, Type Change Beam is such a frustrating card to play against, and the biggest reason for that is going to be the Ashura Star OTK. If we activate Type Change Beam, we just change our opponent's monsters into warriors, absorb all their attack, and hit in for lethal. So what changes would we make to this deck? Well, first things first, Imaginary Reactor to 2. I think 2 is a good number for Imaginary Reactor. The idea behind this change is threefold. First off, we really want to reduce the amount of chances that we have to activate this Imaginary Reactor to get that Pot of Greed effect. Drawing those two cards is pretty crazy, so we just want to see this a little bit less. This just hurts the consistency a little bit. Second off, it makes you decide between using this or negate attack. So now we actually have a conscious decision to make. Are we going to use a really good Legend Trap, or are we going to use 2 copies of Imaginary Reactor? And third, this also forces non-Mataran decks to make the same decision. Realistically, you're not going to play a single reactor as well as a single copy of Monster Reincarnation. That's not really going to work out. So what most decks are probably up to do is just not play reactor at all. And this is something we've been seeing is a ton of different decks playing the Imaginary Reactor package. And I really want to get a lot of the other decks off of this. I mean, ideally, we'd like to get Mataran off of this as well because it's just a little bit too good. But at the very least, I want to have not every deck that is able to run this running it. And this is probably the best way to do so. So this isn't the only hit that we want to throw at Mataran. The next one's a bit weird. This was actually suggested by Quantum Cube, so shout out to him. But this is Sword Dancer to 3. So why do we want to limit Sword Dancer? So basically, we just want to slap a limit 3 on the deck so that Mataran can't just use whatever limit 3 cards they want. Because right now, we're seeing some lists experiment with Call of the Earthbound. We're also seeing some lists experiment with Ghost Cyclone, and a few other things. We've seen like a Noodle Mataran list that we did try out a little bit, and that was quite fun. But we realistically don't want to let a deck that is the number 1 deck, that is almost a tier 0 deck, have the freedom to just take whatever they want off the limit 3 list. So we just want to slap a limit 3 on this deck, and Sword Dancer is quite a good one. Realistically, you're not going to not play all 3 copies of your Sword Dancer. Making a Ashura Star is very, very important for the deck. So by limit 3ing this, we basically just slap you can't just play whatever limit 3s you want on the deck, which is fair enough because pretty much every other deck has to abide by that anyway. And finally, the third and final hit, Type Change Beam to 0. I want this card banned. This card is the cause of so much frustration in this matchup. Type Change Beam does too much. The card seems unassuming, but in Duel Links is actually extraordinarily oppressive. So first things first, this card punishes you for going wide, and most decks in Rush want to go wide or have to go wide in order to play their game. We don't really want to be playing Rush and having to just put everything in defense and only leave one guy in attack. But if we don't do that, your opponent could use Type Change Beam, absorb all your attack with Ashura Star and OTK you, or if you have 2 monsters face up and they can't OTK you, they don't want to, they can just change you into Spellcasters, make Hercules Star and spin your guys away, which is very, very frustrating. This card seemingly does it all, and most of the time is very unfun to play against. I think if we take away Type Change Beam, Mataran goes back to having really strong matchups against certain decks and having really cool toolbox options to deal with specific threats, but then doesn't just get to have this Swiss Army knife that they can use to overcome any threat. And finally, Type Change Beam is having a negative effect on cards that have yet to be released. So Konami has been very reluctant to give us any good back row, and one of the reasons I think that is because not all back row is created equally. Some decks have access to better back row than others based on monster types. So I think Konami doesn't want to give certain types really good back row and not give others, which is why I think they haven't done it yet. But some of those cards that would be really good in this meta to, for example, protect us from getting OTK'd by Ashura Star are cards like Battle Demotion. However, Battle Demotion specifically says, when an opponent's monster declares an attack on your face-up machine type monster. And this is just one example. There are a lot of different cards that are really good back row, but have to have your monster be a specific type. Type Change Beam will basically turn all of these type of effects off. So if we did get these cards, they still would not unfortunately work into Type Change Beam, which is why I really think Type Change Beam has to go. This card is just going to be nothing but headaches, and as we go forward, if Mataran still ends up being a super powerful threat, Type Change Beam is only going to cause more and more problems down the line. So now we're going to talk about buffing some of the weaker decks, some of the decks that were doing okay and then kind of slipped down, or the decks that are kind of topping but aren't really winning anything. And the first one I want to start with is Hyperstrike Dragon, Dragia Star F, or Dragon Fusion. So this deck was actually doing quite well on release, but as soon as Mataran and like Galaxy kind of took off and everyone realized those were the best decks, this deck kind of fell by the wayside as it has pretty rough matchups into both of those decks. Well, this deck basically wants to turbo out Dragia Star F, use its effect to either gain 900 attack and make 2 attacks on monsters, or gain piercing and just attack twice, which can be direct, try and just get in for a ton of damage, do that ideally twice throughout the game, and then end the game like that. This very rarely actually OTKs, and can be a little bit bricky, because we are going to have to play a decent chunk of high-level monsters, including the Dragius, and if we don't actually find Dragius, this deck still doesn't really do much. So how did we want to buff this? Well, one card I would like to see changed is Phoenix Dragon. This is currently limit 3, and I would like to see Phoenix Dragon to 2. By putting Phoenix Dragon to 2, this will allow players to either decide, okay, I'll play 2 of this, as well as the rest of my Dragon package, and I'll just not play Negate Attack. Or we could play the 1 Negate Attack, 1 Phoenix Dragon, and basically just have a little bit of extra consistency. Because of the way the Dragon deck works, Dragius is everything, and the deck mills quite a lot, and so we could just mill a lot of our Dragius. Having Phoenix Dragon gives us a way to put Dragius back in our hand, and the deck really doesn't do anything without Dragius, so having a way to get Dragius to your hand does seem like it would really, really help out the deck. Phoenix Dragon came out limit 3, because realistically at earlier stages, Dragius was the king of rush duels. Right now he has fallen from that throne and is sort of a joke card and doesn't really see much play at all. So I think Phoenix Dragon could quite easily come to 2. I don't think this would be broken, and I also don't think we necessarily want this unlimited yet, but Phoenix Dragon could probably be unlimited a little bit later down the line. Not to mention that unlimiting Phoenix Dragon also helps out all the Dragon decks, and since all of them are struggling, this would be quite nice. This would help Blue Eyes, Blasters Inferno, which is doing okay at the moment, as well as a small boost to like aggro lists. And again, aggro lists aren't really doing anything right now, so I think giving them a small buff would not be the end of the world. Next up we have Spellcasters, and Spellcasters is a hard one to buff based on the cards we currently have. I think realistically, if we want Spellcasters to really thrive in this meta, we're going to have an injection of new cards. More support is what this deck really needs, or a skill change. The biggest issue this deck has right now is that we're quite easily able to make a 7th Paladin, we're quite easily able to make it quite big, and then we attack over, but then our opponent goes defensive until they find a way to kill us, and we don't have a good way to kill them when they just set 3 monsters. Basically, we rely on 7's Road Witch and our skill to give 7's Road Witch piercing, 1600 pierce, attacks over 1 guy. If that guy's got 1000 plus defense, we're only getting in for 600 or less each turn, and we have to hope that we've chipped them down enough between that and the 7th Paladin big hit that we can actually close the game. Most of the time that won't be the case, which is why this deck is struggling. So this isn't really a direct buff to this deck, but one thing I think we could do is unlimit Thunder Gazelle. Thunder Gazelle is a bit of a weird card. I think realistically this card was limited 3, just to give Thunder a limit 3 card. This card also is very restrictive. It only works if your opponent doesn't have cards in their hand, which is not always going to be the case. So it's not even that crazy good. So currently, this does see play in the Spellcaster list at 2 to 3 copies, so just unlimiting it would give Spellcasters a few more options. This isn't really a Spellcaster unlimit, I just think Gazelle could come off the list, and it would somewhat benefit the Spellcasters. And then there is Elemental Heroes. Elemental Heroes are so close to being good. We have seen them top a little bit, but they've been struggling as of late. Again, I'm not really sure if there's anything we can do with the restricted list to really bump them up, but they are so close. Maybe if we just hit all the decks above them, they can slowly rise, but there's nothing directly I think we can do to really give this deck the push it needs. Maybe again another injection of cards will help out the heroes. So now we'll talk about just some of the other hits that I would like to make, and the first one is quite drastic, and this is Widespread Ruin to 2. So originally we had Negate Attack to 2, and that would force decks to play Widespread Ruin instead of Negate Attack. Now that was during a meta where Widespread Ruin was a lot worse. Because Mataran is currently such a strong deck, Widespread Ruin actually hurts Mataran in some cases a lot more than Negate Attack. So being forced to play Widespread Ruin is not as bad as it used to be. Now, Widespread Ruin is still bad into decks like Galaxy, because Secret Order protects their monsters from being destroyed. So it is still arguably better most of the time to play Negate Attack, but Widespread Ruin is still reasonably good right now. So it's not really a tax or a punishment for the stronger decks to have to play Widespread Ruin now. But we have just recently gotten a new Legend Trap in Trap Hole. So what I would like to say is, if you want to play Limit 2 cards, then we can play Trap Hole instead of Widespread or Negate Attack. This way it will see Trap Hole see a little bit more play, and again, this tax will only have to be paid by the very, very best decks. The strongest decks in the game are the ones that are going to have cards in the Limit 2 list, so forcing them to have to use the less desirable Legend Trap, I think would actually be quite good for the game. And the next card I want put to Limit 2 is Call of the Earthbound. So by releasing this from Limit 3, this will allow Limit 3 decks to have it as an option. Now, most of those decks that have a Limit 3 will most likely want to play one of the Limit 2 legends in either Widespread or Negate Attack, which is fine. Then we just play one single copy of Call of the Earthbound, and we can have that in there as an extra defensive option against some of the stronger decks. Now again, those stronger decks are already going to have plenty of Limit 2s, so they won't have the option to play Call of the Earthbound, but a lot of the weaker decks will have the option to play this card, which I think will balance things out quite nicely. We'll let the weaker decks have access to more options, and will restrict the stronger decks from being able to play whatever they want. And that just brings us to our Unlimit. So there are a bunch of cards that I think could just come off of the restricted list, and we're going to fire through some of those now. The first of which is Greystorm Reverie. This card came out in a structure deck and has done basically nothing. I think we could unlimit this card. I know Konami is a bit scared of this card because it can double attack, and basically all double attackers must be limited. But I don't think this card is really that bad. This card is quite expensive. The skill that goes along with it, we have to give up a card so it doesn't plus us. We also have to send a card from our field to the graveyard to use its effect. It's very situational that it'll ever actually get to attack twice. And realistically, by taking this off of Limit 3, we just allow this deck to play Secret Order, which will let it use that in conjunction with Galactica Oblivion, which I don't think would be that crazy. I think this would be a playable deck, maybe a tier 3, maybe even a tier 2 deck, but I don't think it would be broken. I don't think it would ridiculously overtake the meta or anything. So I think Reverie Unlimited would be completely fine. Then we have Atra Sho Hydron. So Cyburst is in a terrible spot in the meta right now. Basically all of the Cyburst monsters, except for a few exceptions, have 0 or 100 defense, and that means they are food for Galaxy. Galaxy is absolutely destroying this deck, as well as the fact this deck doesn't do too well into Mataran either, and they're kind of the two best decks right now. Mataran can just sit in defense mode the entire time, and unless Cyburst finds exactly Yggdrago, they can't really punish this or deal with it. They just kind of have to wait until they draw the pieces, whilst their opponent waits until they draw all of their pieces, and then they'll just kill you. So this deck has a really, really bad time in this meta right now, so I think Atra Sho Hydron to 3 would be fine. Let them just have 3 copies of Hydron, I don't think that'd be the end of the world, and it would allow them to have access to their Legend Traps again. Giving them Negate Attack is probably going to be really, really strong, especially since it's really good into, very specifically, like Galaxy, which is this deck's worst matchup. And then we'll talk about Aim Eagle, because if we're freeing the Cyburst, we might as well free the Machines as well. Machines hasn't really done anything this meta. We did see a little bit of experimentation as Go Rush released, and the deck was doing okay, but realistically we could probably free Aim Eagle. Ultimate Bond is not really seeing any play right now at all. Aim Eagle is still like a fine card, and basically makes the deck more consistent. But primarily, this is going to just allow them to, again, use those Legend Traps, more specifically Negate Attack, which Machine would probably quite like. As well as the fact that Machine good stuff that does use the Earth Machines, and thus is not using Ultimate Bond, is probably better than this deck anyway. Then we have Seahorse Carrier, and I think it is time we free the Seahorse. Aqua has been oppressed for too long. Realistically, Seahorse Carrier went on the list to stop good stuff piles, or just any deck that wasn't restricted from using it, to just have this free plus. Every deck seems to have a plus right now, so I don't think it really matters. We're basically just gatekeeping this card from Aqua for no reason at this point. I don't think if this card suddenly went to 3, every deck would be playing it. So release the Carrier. Let Aqua have their toy back. And then there's Thousand Knives. Thousand Knives is a card I've gone back and forth with quite a bit. I think Thousand Knives could be unlimited. This is just a really good tool for Dark Magician. Now the only downside would be Dark Magician already has Dark Magic Attack, which is reasonably strong, and has recently gotten Secret Order, which has also given it a bit of a boost. Now, that deck is still not realistically doing anything, but 3,000 knives could change that. Now, would this suddenly make it too strong? Realistically, I don't think so, but I think this is something we'd have to keep an eye on, because just having basically 3 Tribute to the Doomed where you don't have to discard a card is pretty strong. But I realistically think this would push Dark Magician into being very playable, maybe a tier 3 deck, so I would love to see 1,000 Knives be unlimited. And then there's Dark Sword Magician. This could probably just come out, like it can come out occasionally as just a normal summon 2500 guy. I think that's probably fine. It can't be destroyed by card effects if you have 6 more spells in your graveyard. That's maybe more relevant now than it ever has been, but I think this is probably fine. Just release it. Then the Shining City Knights. I can only assume this was on here to stop Dragius from getting the boost. A lot of the time, light decks are quite strong in Rush, so I can see the want to restrict it, but I don't think this needs to be restricted. This card barely seen any play whatsoever. Then there's Shock Dragon. Shock Dragon, again, can be a bit scary, but Dragon decks are really not doing much right now, and most decks are type locked anyway, so it's only really Dragon decks that be able to make good use of this, and maybe some aggro lists. Shock Dragon could probably come off the list. Then Spark Cart's Girl makes no sense for this card to be on the list whatsoever. I don't know why this card is on the list. Just free it from the list, Konami. There's no reason for this card to be there. Then Swift Gaia. Again, Swift Gaia sometimes will come out as a normal summon 23. I think that's completely fine. Realistically, this isn't going to break anything. Maybe we could actually make some good warrior decks with this, so just release Swift Gaia. Then there's Geeka, the Shadowflower Beauty. This card just feels very strange. Now, this feels like Konami just want every deck to have a limit 3, so they slap this on the plants. Even though the plant deck has done literally nothing, I don't think the plant deck is ever going to realistically do anything until we get their fusions and their traps, which will be a lot further down the line. And even then, I don't think Geeka is the card that needs to be limited. So yeah, just release Geeka. Then there's Steel Steed Martin Vinery, and once again, this is a card that can attack multiple times, so that's why it's on the list. But again, this card has done nothing. I don't think this is going to make a huge deal. Occasionally, you're going to flip 3 heads, and it's going to feel like, oh, you got lucky and he OTK'd, but that's going to happen so rarely, I don't think we have to be worried about Martin Binary. Then there's Necrom Man the Third, and this is another one of those cards that just kind of plus us. There was some talk about this being used in Heroes, but it never really found its footing. This card could be a little bit better later on, but realistically, it's not done anything. We could probably just take it off the list. And finally, Burst Stream of Destruction. So we have already talked about giving us back Phoenix Dragon, but unlimiting Burst Stream of Destruction is not going to change the amount we have. We still only have 1 copy. So why would we unlimit this? Well, because that means we can play our other traps. We do have 2 trap cards that Blue Eyes does quite like in that limit 1 slot. We have the Sword and Shield, and we have Dragon's Fortitude. So by releasing Burst Stream of Destruction, we give us access to those traps to go along with Blue Eyes. Blue Eyes, again, hasn't done anything in ages. Realistically, it would be fine. But with all of our changes, this is what our new limit restricted list would look like. I suppose we'd also have a little ban section saying TCB, but this is a lot smaller, and I think this does work quite well. Now, there are a few other cards that we could possibly move around, such as Graveyard Grudge probably doesn't need to be here. Meet and Greed should probably be moved somewhere, but it's hard to work out where you want this. We could unlimit Meet and Greed, but that does then cause the issue of, again, Meeg OTK might become a bit of a weird thing, but it could just be fine. Realistically, I don't think Meeg is suddenly going to become a really, really powerful deck. Oh, sorry, Miss Mutton. But overall, I think I'm quite happy with the way that this looks. I think this would be healthier. I think this would be more fun. But more importantly, at least hopefully, this would lower the power level of Mataran and Light Galaxy and allow some of the other decks to kind of breathe and have a few more options. But what do you think about this list? Are there any more changes that you would like to see to the meta? Again, we have not touched any skills. We have only touched the limit and restricted list. So if there's anything else you would like to see changed, move around, anything else you'd like to see banned, anything else you'd like to see limited or unlimited, please throw it down in the comments below and I would love to talk about it. But thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you next time.